The first time you realize that time is not an endless room but a narrowing corridor is rarely cinematic. It arrives in small, precise ways. A photograph you don't remember posing for, the sudden unreadability of a parent's face, a song that used to be background and now presses against your chest. That moment, ordinary and swift, lifts the veil. Mortality, not as an abstract lesson taught in distant metaphors, but as a personal, uninvited fact, becomes an axis around which the rest of your life begins to rotate. From that pivot, the world looks different. Choices expand and shrink at once. Trivialities seem both ridiculous and unbearably dear, and every silence acquires density. This narration begins in that hush. Consider how awareness of death reframes what we call decision. Before the awareness, choices are options to be sampled. A restaurant, a job, a partner. After the awareness, choices are statements about what sort of life will go on under the mark of your finite hours. A job is not only a salary, it is a ledger of attention, of mornings surrendered. A relationship is not merely companionship. It is a future you promise to visit. Mortality makes weight out of possibility. It drafts urgency into otherwise indifferent days. But urgency is a double-edged sword. It sharpens the value of now, and it can paralyze with its insistence that everything must matter. Why does this happen inside us? Psychology gives us a clue. The mind is a meaning-making machine. Faced with the knowledge that life ends, it searches for coherence. Awareness of mortality gives rise to narratives, religions, philosophies, ideologies, careers, families that promise continuity or transcendence. A parent who sees her child as a continuation of herself reduces the terror of one life ending by imagining a self that diffuses into another. An artist seeks immortality in work, a scientist in contribution, a believer in eternal life. Each is a strategy, akin to the cognitive maneuvers we use to keep the sense of unpredictability and finality from crushing us. Yet these strategies also constitute the architecture of individuality, the private, curated ways we choose to stand before the abyss. And so the paradox emerges. In trying to escape annihilation through meaning, we fashion identities that set us apart. We become individual beings whose inner life is a testimony and a claim. This is my taste, my truth, my story. That claim is the seabed of creativity, an impulse to make, to differ, to mark the world with an arrangement of values that can, perhaps, outlast the body that conceived them. Creativity is, in part, an answer to mortality. To leave a trace is to argue that you existed. But the same assertion that yields art can also isolate. When identity becomes a fortress of singular vision, community becomes the risky frontier. Others do not always recognize or cherish our marks. They respond with misrecognition, rivalry, or indifference. The very act of affirming I in the face of not I builds walls even while erecting wings. This tension between individuality and community is the crucible of loneliness and companionship alike. Imagine two people, each with a different strategy for meaning. One finds safety in group belonging, subsuming personal anxieties into collective rituals that promise continuity. Festivals, affiliations, the smooth certainty of tradition. The other treads a solitary path, generating meaning by constant reinvention, by the hard work of personal authorship. Both strategies are attempts to answer the same existential question. How do I matter? But they answer it in divergent ontologies of self. The communal pathway offers the warmth of shared identity but risks erasing the distinctiveness that gives rise to innovation. The individualistic pathway protects creative integrity but can give rise to solitude so profound that presence itself feels hollow. Each path alleviates death's sting in one way and aggravates it in another. Loneliness, in this context, is not merely a lack of company. It is the felt discrepancy between the private architecture of meaning and the world's capacity to hold it. It shows up when the stories you tell yourself about who you are, why you act, what you value, are not mirrored back by the people around you. That mismatch can be agonizing because our identities are partly relational. We discover ourselves through echoes. When echoes fail, we must bear not only our mortality but the experiential evidence that our meanings do not resonate. And yet, loneliness is also fertile. In the quiet that remains when community is absent, new forms of thought and artistry can germinate. Many creative breakthroughs and philosophical insights were born of solitude. The sting of not being seen compels an inwardness that, if tended, yields depth. Here lies another twist. Awareness of mortality produces both fear and liberation. Fear is the most obvious, a feeling that compresses time and concentrates attention on survival, comfort, and avoidance of pain. Liberation is subtler and deeper. When one truly internalizes finitude, it can free one from the paralytic endlessness of options. If life were infinite, there would always be time to postpone, to deliberate, to accumulate experiences without risk. Finite life forces a decisiveness that can lead to courage, saying what needs to be said before silence becomes permanent, choosing an imperfect love rather than perpetually searching for idealized perfection. In a strange alignment, mortality can be the engine of authenticity. The knowledge that a choice is irreversible in the long arc of a life compels a certain fidelity, to a value, to a person, to a craft. What, then, is the psychology that allows someone to convert the pressure of mortality into freedom rather than despair? One pathway is cognitive reorientation, changing the interpretation of finitude from catastrophe to a condition that clarifies. This is not naive optimism. It is a disciplined reframing. Instead of asking, "What will I lose?" one asks, "What will I commit to if I accept the limits?" This reorientation is a practice. Naming priorities aloud, practicing small commitments that cultivate trust in oneself, and learning to tolerate ambiguity. Another psychological tool is meaning salience, intentionally amplifying certain values so they guide behavior. Rituals, both private and communal, serve this function. Small rituals, preparing tea mindfully, greeting a sunrise, are not mere habits. They are embodied pledges that embed meaning in rhythm. Philosophy adds another layer. Existential thinkers argue that freedom and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. Once you see that your choices are not predetermined by cosmic script, you must own them. This ownership is daunting but sovereign. Stoicism invites a tempering of desires, focusing on what one can control and accepting what one cannot, thereby reducing the tyranny of hypothetical futures. Humanism emphasizes the responsibility to create value within our shared world. Both traditions converge on an important point. Mortality sharpens moral vision when we accept that our choices are the primary currency of meaning. But theory alone is not enough. The human brain, wired for threat detection, often defaults to narrow survival frames. So we need practices that bridge cognition and action. Start with constraint-based living. Choose a few projects and give them time. Constraint paradoxically opens the space for creativity by providing the edges within which play can happen. Cultivate small communities of recognition, people who will see and reflect your efforts back to you. Enter into agreements. Not contracts for outcomes, but covenants of presence, regular calls with a friend, a weekly shared meal, so that recognition is not left to chance. Practice mortality's counterintuitive generosity by making commitments you intend to keep. Fidelity becomes an antidote to the atomizing effects of modern individualism. Let us pause and ask a question meant to be held rather than answered immediately. If every choice becomes weighty under the gaze of time, how do you choose without being crushed by the knowledge that each path forecloses others? Is the answer to choose less or to choose more deliberately? The living answer lies in balancing exploration with commitment, sampling enough to inform true preference, then leaning into a chosen direction with the humility that admits revision but the courage that accepts risk. Mortality is neither villain nor savior. It is a condition that reframes the stage upon which individuality, community, loneliness, and creativity play. It bestows urgency and offers liberation, splits us from one another and compels us to seek one another out. The task, then, is not to defeat mortality but to learn the forms of life that let it be a teacher rather than a tormentor. There is a difference between clock time and the time that lives inside you. Clocks hum on the wall and make the days legible for social life. Meetings, trains, salaries, and seasons. The inner clock is less tidy. It is elastic, knotty, and prone to optical illusions. 1 hour can be a lifetime when grief presses down. A year can vanish like breath in the wind when joy is full and attention is scattered. This subjective elasticity is not just a trick of poetry. It is the crucible in which meaning is cooked. How long a life feels has enormous power over the decisions we make. The length of our commitments, the courage of our risks, the tenderness of our small everyday acts. To understand how mortality molds choice, we must first learn the anatomy of subjective time. At the most basic level, the mind privileges the immediate. The future is distant and hazy by design. Evolution rewarded organisms that valued the next meal over a hypothetical harvest in 10 years. That bias, often called present bias, explains many of the ways we procrastinate and defer the weightier goods for the cheaper immediate ones. But the same bias can be enlisted for good. If the present is disproportionately persuasive, then the shaping of present moments becomes the chief lever for shaping a life. How we fill the now, how we ritualize minutes, translates into the arc of years. The small acts of attention, returning a book to the shelf, answering a beloved's message with honest presence, practicing a skill for 15 minutes are not merely tiny. They are the atoms of a life lived under the knowledge of finitude. And yet the mind also tells stories about the future, narratives that sometimes reduce it to an indistinct blur and sometimes make it a vivid scene. The psychological concept of future self-continuity captures this. Some people feel the person they will become as a stranger, others as an intimate cousin. If your future self feels far away, it is easier to treat them cruelly, to spend their money, neglect their health, postpone their dreams. If your future self is familiar, you plan on their behalf, you invest, you conserve, you write letters inward across years. This continuity is malleable. Through deliberate practice, we can thicken the thread between who we are now and who we will be, writing to the self, imagining future celebrations, describing future failures with specificity, thereby making future costs and benefits more real. When mortality is salient, connecting vividly to future selves is not optimism. It is a practical restitution of justice across time, a way to honor the life that will continue in one form or another after today. Time also accumulates psychologically as narrative. We do not experience our lives as a ledger of moments, but as stories stitched together. Chapters, turning points, a protagonist's arc. These narratives are not neutral records. They are creative interventions. They choose which moments to hold, which to compress, which to magnify. In this process, regret and hope play leading roles. Regret is the backward-looking lens that intensifies the weight of missed chances. Hope is the forward-looking flame that makes possibility attractive despite risk. Both are responses to mortality. Regret is the mind's moral ledger, reminding us that some doors, once closed, do not easily reopen. Hope is the imaginative faculty that tolerates loss and entices us to act anyway. The philosophical and psychological work is to allow regret to become a teacher rather than a tyrant, to let hope be courageous rather than naive. How do we cultivate that delicate balance? One practice begins with the deliberate composition of our narratives. Instead of living as an accidental compilation of preferences and obligations, try composing evenings and weeks with an eye toward the story you want to tell at the end of a chapter. Ask yourself, if today were to be one of the pages I would later reread, what would I want to notice in it? This question is small enough to act upon, but large enough to alter trajectory. It converts hours into evidence for a life rather than mere consumption of time. Another powerful practice is the ritual of perspective-taking. Stepping outside the immediacy of desire to view a decision from the vantage point of decades. Imagine a conversation with your 80-year-old self. Let them ask you, not about what you bought, but about what you loved and whom you loved. This exercise is not escapist fantasy. It is recalibration. It simulates future self-continuity and forces the present to reckon with long-term identity. People who habitually orient toward a future life find their choices tending toward durable investments, relationships, health, craft, rather than ephemeral gratifications. There is also a paradoxical remedy in constraint. Infinite choice is a modern luxury that tempts us into endless postponement. There must be a better job, a better city, a better partner, tomorrow. Mortality narrows possibilities by decree, which can be terrifying, but chosen constraint is different from imposed limitation. To choose a boundary is to create a field of play in which depth is possible. Commit to a project for a year and watch how constraints force creative problem solving. Enter into a relationship with the vow of practicing presence for a defined period and see how small rituals transform intimacy. These are micro-covenants with time. Agreements that make the subjective now denser and therefore more meaningful. We should also attend to the role of attention. Attention is time's engine. Wherever attention goes, time seems to densify. Multitasking thins experiences until they are translucent. Deep attention transforms a single afternoon into a memory that will cushion you for years. There are practices to sharpen attention that are neither mystical nor costly. Single tasking for set intervals, learning the discipline of showing up for small, repeated commitments, and cultivating gratitude in the form of precise noticing. Gratitude, when practiced with specificity, lengthens subjective time by burdening the moment with significance. Naming 3 concrete things you noticed or received in a day is not sentimentality. It is an archive-building exercise that furnishes the future with material to tell a richer story about your life. Loneliness threads through all of this as both danger and resource. Time spent alone, if involuntary, can hollow. If intentional, it can deepen. The key difference lies in recognition. Whether solitude is chosen and framed as an opportunity for refurbishing your inner life, or whether it is imposed and experienced as punishment. Practices that reconcile individuality with community are vital here. Create small rituals of reciprocity, not grand obligations but consistent channels of mutual recognition. A weekly phone call with an elder, a monthly dinner with a friend whose presence refracts you back to yourself, a shared project that tolerates failure. These are communal stitches that keep your narrative from unraveling into isolated episodes. Philosophy nudges us further. The existentialists remind us that mortality is the condition that makes authenticity possible. When death is acknowledged, the question is not what life can avoid, but what it can affirm. Stoic clarity instructs us to differentiate between what is within our control and what is not. In matters of time, we control only our commitments and our attention. Neither school promises ease, both promise clarity. The challenge is to synthesize their lessons into a daily craft. Tolerate ambiguity, accept loss, and invest in acts of meaning that are within reach. Before moving on, hold this question like a small torch. If your inner time is a fabric you can weave, what pattern do you choose? Are you willing to weave loose threads that allow novelty, or will you weave tight, durable cloth to shelter commitments? There is no single right pattern, only contours of taste shaped by temperament, community, and circumstance. The practice is to choose with awareness rather than drift in the current. There is a secret architecture around us that organizes how we feel time. The invisible scaffolding of social rhythms. Wake-up bells, workplace calendars, religious services, family dinners, seasonal festivals. These are not mere conveniences. They are the drumbeat that synchronizes lonely interior clocks into a communal cadence. When our private time aligns with the collective tempo, life feels smoother. When it diverges, everything seems to drag or race, as if we had stepped out of the orchestra and were trying to play our own instrument on a different score. This is why the rituals we inherit and the institutions we inhabit matter so deeply. They teach us whether to hurry, whether to wait, whether to mourn publicly or privately, whether to celebrate in abundance or to mark scarcity with restraint. Consider the village that gathers every evening at a communal hearth. The act of coming together at a fixed hour does more than exchange news. It teaches bodies and minds a pattern of arrival and departure. It makes time predictable and held. Compare this to the modern urban life of shifting shifts, endless notifications, and on-demand services that promise to compress or expand time at will. In such environments, after hours bleed into work hours, meals are eaten to the rhythm of screens, and rituals dissolve into convenience. That disappearance is not neutral. It alters our sense of meaning. Without shared markers, moments lose their public memory. A triumph celebrated alone tends to be smaller in the mind's ledger than a triumph that becomes a story the community retells for years. We are, at root, story creatures, and social rhythms are the scaffolding that turns sparks into narratives. Institutions, schools, religious organizations, workplaces, legal systems also template our temporal expectations. Some cultures prize patience, deferring gratification across generations. Others valorize immediacy, rewarding rapid movement and reinvention. This is not merely taste. It shapes how we think of life's arc. If your society rewards the long investment, apprenticeship, loyalty, cumulative craft, you are taught to imagine a self that unfolds slowly, to trust that time will consolidate effort into legacy. If your society rewards quick wins and perpetual innovation, you are trained to expect speed and to fear stagnation, so your inner chronology tightens into a sequence of starts and pivots. Neither model is morally superior. Each has costs and boons. The long view cultivates depth and suffering endurance. The rapid view fosters adaptability and a shorter sting of being left behind. The tragedy is when we are given neither. A culture that demands both perpetual reinvention and long-term loyalty, which leaves individuals anxious and institutions brittle. Rituals, moreover, do more than mark time. They transfigure it. A wedding spoken in an ancient formula, a funeral with each liturgical pause, a communal harvest blessing. These are practices that stretch ordinary hours into an experience of meaning by layering them with memory. Rituals slow the present and anchor it in the past and the future simultaneously. They are cultural techniques for managing mortality. They encode grief so it can be shared and processed. They encode gratitude so it can be returned and repeated. When rituals are lost or flattened into etiquette, the techniques for communal handling of loss and joy atrophy too. People float through major life events with fashionable efficiency but little shared comprehension. The result is an epidemic of unacknowledged transitions. We change jobs, partners, countries, and none of the old scaffolds tell us how to mark the move. So the transitions accumulate as small, unprocessed losses that, compounded, weigh heavily on our inner calendars. Gossip, derided as trivial, is, in truth, a temporal calibrator. Through talk, we learn who stayed faithful, who abandoned a project, who aged with grace, and who stopped trying. Gossip draws social lines about reputations, and reputations are the longitudinal memory of a community. When we live in small networks where reputations travel slowly, our past actions echo for longer. When online virality accelerates reputation cycles into obsolescence, the past is both weaponized and erased quickly. The way we judge and remember one another matters to how we project ourselves forward. If a society readily forgives, people are allowed to experiment. If it punishes failure harshly and permanently, people clutch to conservatism and avoid risk. Thus, gossip, institutional memory, and public narratives collectively teach whether futures are plastic or brittle. Obligation functions similarly but more mechanistically. Obligations are the contracts we make with time. Paying taxes, caregiving, monthly rent, these are repeated claims on the hours of our lives. Some obligations are liberating. They structure time, create habits, and provide meaning through service. Others are crushing. They monopolize bandwidth and leave little room for generative choice. The moral work is not to abolish obligation, that is impossible and undesirable, but to curate which obligations are constitutive and which are merely consuming. How do we do that? Partly by renegotiating the social languages around duty. We need public conversations that allow us to speak frankly about what obligations we can bear and which we cannot, and to create institutions that redistribute burdens rather than merely applauding stoic endurance. That redistribution is not merely economic. It is temporal justice, the idea that societies should arrange time so that its burdens and gifts are fairly shared. If social rhythms shape our subjective time, then we can, with intention, rebuild rhythms that honor finitude without turning it into scarcity theater. Scarcity theater is the spectacle of pretending that every opportunity is unique in the way of a life or death sale. Always act now or lose everything. It weaponizes mortality into urgency for urgency sake, producing anxiety and frenetic decision-making. A healthier alternative would be to create public and private rituals that make loss visible and communal, that teach deliberation without procrastination. We might design transition rituals in companies for people leaving roles, create neighborhood remembrance days for farewells, revive mealtime etiquette that disconnects devices for sustained conversation, or institutionalize sabbaticals as normal rather than exceptional. These are not grand legislative acts. They are cultural choices that retempo life. Here are small practices that can be embedded into social life to resynchronize clocks. First, set collective anchors, regular, non-negotiable times for presence, family dinners, study halls, neighborhood walks. Second, ritualize endings. A brief public acknowledgement when someone departs a role or relationship can transform private exile into shared closure. Third, cultivate collective memory. Keep small archives of community stories, photos, notes, oral histories that teach younger members about continuity. Fourth, normalize repair and forgiveness rituals so that social time allows for mistakes without permanent exile. These measures teach us that time is neither a commodity to be monetized nor an enemy to be outrun. It is an edible substance, prepared and shared with care. But there is an unavoidable friction. Communities exert a centripetal force that can squash individuality. The very rhythms that bind us can also bind us into stasis. We must therefore consider how to protect the creative divergence that mortality also calls forth. The answer is not an either/, or but a both/, and societies can both hold rhythms that support shared meaning and cultivate enclaves that allow experimentation. Think of apprenticeship systems that combine communal initiation with the freedom for a young craftsperson to innovate within their guild. Or small, intentionally eccentric communities that function as laboratories for new social forms but remain porous to the larger culture. The key is permeability. Institutions must allow for the movement of ideas and people without ossifying them. Ask yourself now, which rhythms in your life were inherited, and which did you choose? When did you accept a pattern because everyone else did, and when did you resist in order to preserve a personal tempo? When you imagine a society that honors mortality, what rituals does it retain, and which new ones does it invent? These questions are not rhetorical ornaments. They are actionable invitations. They invite us to step into the communal design process rather than be passively shaped by it. Please take a pause, notice a subtle hope. Time, social as it is, can be reclaimed as a shared resource. We are not helpless before calendars and institutions. With modest communal will, the architecture of time can be remodeled to support depth, reduce gratuitous scarcity, and allow creative solitude to flourish next to shared meaning. There is a particular silence that arises when a person first places something original into the world. It is the hush after the ship has slipped from the dock, not the confident, ceremonial silence of applause, but a softer, more dangerous quiet that asks, will anyone notice this? Will anyone care? That silence is where lonely creativity lives. It is a solitude inhabited not by absence, but by a kind of double listening. Listening to the work itself and listening for the world's response. The knowledge of mortality makes this silence thicker. When you know that time is scarce, every creative act feels like a test of whether your life will leave a mark. That pressure can inflame ambition and sharpen craft, or it can convulse the body into stasis, a fear so heavy that nothing is made at all. Creativity and loneliness are siblings born under the same sky. To make something that does not yet exist is to step outside the map everyone else uses. You must imagine territories before they are acknowledged by maps, and that requires a temperament willing to bear the discomfort of being unrecognizable. In that sense, solitude is a necessary discipline. It allows the mind to accumulate associations, to return to an obsession again and again, to witness the slow accretion of shape. But solitude without relation is brittle. Creativity wants echo. It wants someone to read, to play, to contradict, to misread in interesting ways. Without feedback, without that public mirror, the most elegant private gestures risk becoming self-amusements, brilliant but unreadable gifts left unopened on a shelf. The tension between private meaning and public expectation is the place where conflict often arises. Imagine a person whose inner conviction insists that a truth be told that the group finds uncomfortable. Perhaps it is an artist exposing an injustice, a scientist publishing an inconvenient result, a family member breaking a silence about abuse. The community responds with shock, denial, or retribution because that truth threatens the community's coherence. On the surface, the conflict looks like disagreement. Beneath it is the raw calculus of time and continuity. Communities depend on certain narratives to hold. Myths that reassure, practices that bind, reputations that smooth interactions. When a private narrative challenges those foundations, the community's sense of future continuity feels jeopardized. The scripts that promise stability are suddenly brittle. The community will try to maintain its tempo by damping dissent, and the dissenter, pressed by mortality's urgency, will press harder. What is to be done when private meaning collides with communal structure? There is no formula that guarantees both truth-telling and community preservation. History is full of ruptures that were necessary and others that were destructive. But practical and ethical strategies exist that can reduce wreckage while preserving integrity. First, consider the craft of translation. Speak the private truth in a language that the community can receive. That does not mean diluting moral content into euphemism. It means finding narratives and metaphors that expose rather than hammer, that invite recognition rather than alienation. Second, create scaffolding. Introduce challenging ideas in small, repeated exposures and situate them within gestures of respect. Third, build allyship before confrontation. Loneliness in dissent is not noble theater. It is a strategic disadvantage. Seek out those whose own timelines and anxieties make them receptive. Fourth, be prepared for exit. Sometimes the moral arc requires leaving a community intact in order to preserve one's integrity. Exiting with ritual, telling stories about what was learned, honoring shared joys even while declining shared errors, can prevent the dissolution into mutual contempt. Criticism and rejection deserve their own tenderness. The first blow of dismissal often feels like a verdict on your worth rather than an appraisal of the work. Mortality compounds that sting. The fear that this rejection will be your epitaph, that your life's effort will evaporate into indifference. Psychological tools help here. Reframe criticism as data rather than judgment of being. Separate identity from output, hard because we are story creatures, but possible with practice. Keep a ledger of small successes. Past times you were refused and yet later found a different audience. Build a ritual of repair. After a critique, take a concrete action, rest, revise, ask a clarifying question to re-anchor your sense of agency. Lonely creativity is also the wellspring of novel moral imagination. When a single mind stays with a problem long enough, it sometimes finds a perspective the crowd could not see. We must guard the conditions that allow such sustained attention. Economic support, time to fail, communities that tolerate eccentricity. Societies that fetishize productivity and immediate marketability narrow the bandwidth available for deep work. Here, mortality is weaponized by economic structures that demand immediate proof of worth. The ethical response is not merely individual stoicism. It is political imagination. Advocate for structures, fellowships, universal basic supports, public underwriting of the arts and sciences that allow people to risk time on projects whose benefits are uncertain and may appear only long after the originator is gone. This is temporally generous citizenship, arranging societal time so that the weight of mortality does not compel every life into immediacy. There is an inner ethics to creativity as well. The desire to leave a trace, to outlast the body, can sometimes weaponize creativity into selfish monument making. We recognize this when legacy becomes a vanity project that ignores the harm it causes to others. To guard against this, practice the discipline of reciprocity. Ensure that your creative acts also feed the lives of others, that they do not use other people's time as mere scaffolding for personal fame. Ask who benefits from your work now, not only who might benefit after you are gone. This is not a funeral for ambition. It is an insistence that ambition be socialized, that creativity be both expressive and responsive. Conflict often escalates where reputational economies are brittle. In small communities where reputations are long-lived and unforgiving, people hesitate to try. In large, fast cultures where virality can elevate or exile overnight, the calculus is different. Risk is rewarded with rapid attention but also rapid forgetting. The creative person must navigate these currents with prudence. One tactic is staged exposure. Iterate publicly in low-stakes environments before entering larger, riskier arenas. Think of it as sound-checking your courage. Another tactic is to form micro-communities that act as incubators. People who will be honest but kind, rigorous but not annihilating. These micro-communities provide the echo that turns private work into public practice without the brutal exposure of the main stage. Loneliness can be transformed into fellowship by ritualizing the creative process. Shared studios with time blocks for collective work, public reading nights where failure is honored as evidence of risk-taking, critique circles that begin with stating what was learned rather than what failed. These practices reframe feedback as scaffolding rather than demolition. When communities adopt forms that moderate the venom of critique, they nourish sustained innovation. When they do not, creative people withdraw, and culture loses potential futures. Courage in this domain is not raw bravado. It is a practiced willingness to show up despite evidence of risk, to make small public commitments and keep them, to accept that some gestures will be misunderstood, and to cultivate repair when harm is done. Courage also includes humility, acknowledging that one does not own the only truth and being ready to revise. That humility is ethical muscle that reduces destructive conflict without surrendering integrity. Finally, the negotiation between private meaning and public expectation asks us to expand the moral imagination about time itself. Instead of treating mortality as a personal problem, a private anxiety to be solved with self-help rituals, we could see it as a communal resource that invites shared responsibility. What if communities acknowledged mortality explicitly in the design of their institutions? What if workplaces scheduled creative time that was protected from immediate deliverables? What if neighborhoods held fail-fests, where people shared projects that didn't land, and these were celebrated as evidence of daring? These are not utopian fantasies. They are small cultural inventions that shift the burden of mortality from the isolated individual to a shared, reparable public. Consider this: the act of creating under the gaze of finitude is an ethical performance. It asks you to weigh not only what you will leave behind, but also how that leaving affects the living. It asks for practices of translation, allyship, staged exposure, and ritualized repair. It invites institutions to become temporally generous rather than exploitative. And it insists that the lonely hours in which creation is born be met, somewhere, by someone who says, with sincere attention, "I see you." There is an anatomy to conflict you only learn by feeling its temperature change. At first, it is a small irritation, two voices that could be harmonized but instead sharpened because someone feels unseen. Then it becomes a quarrel. Words become votes, gestures become evidence, and suddenly each party feels as if they are not merely defending an opinion, but defending the continuance of a life's meaning. Mortality turns disagreements into matters of legacy. When time is scarce, every lost argument feels like a lost hour, every slight like a reduction in the ledger of what we can accomplish before the lights go out. This intensifies conflict in ways that surprise us. Small slights metastasize into permanent ruptures. Debates that would once have been curiosities calcify into identities to be defended at all costs. The stakes feel cosmic because the horizon is finite. Why does this happen? Part of the explanation lives in the limbic circuitry that amplifies perceived threats to our worldview. But underneath the neurochemistry, there is an existential arithmetic. Identity is a promise we make ourselves about how the remainder of our days will be spent. And when others deny or contest that promise, it can seem like a theft of future possibility. Consider how families break when a child chooses a life that contradicts long-held values, or how political communities fracture when a new narrative appears that reassigns honor and blame. Each contest is, at its root, a dispute about what counts as a life well lived and who gets to write that story. Mortality sharpens the edges because there is less time to bargain, more urgency to consolidate what matters. This urgency produces familiar defensive moves. Some people double down on narratives that give them certainty. Doctrines, ideologies, rituals that promise continuity. Others flee into proceduralism, preferring rules to the messy work of relationship. Still others weaponize time itself, accusing opponents of being reckless with the future, presenting themselves as the stewards of continuity. All of these moves are human and all are understandable. Yet each has a cost. Rigid doctrines close the mind, endless procedure starves the soul, and moral grandstanding corrodes trust. The hard ethical question is not whether these responses are natural. It is how to hold them without letting them ossify into the end of conversation. There are inner practices that ease this pressure. Begin by recognizing how much of your reactivity is actually a grief disguised as anger. When a conversation feels like a generational verdict, name the loss that hums beneath. The loss of a future you had imagined, the loss of respect you once thought secure. Grief named is less likely to turn malignant. Practice deliberate slowing. When you feel the heat, pause and ask a question of the breath. What future am I defending here? Sometimes simply drawing attention to the temporal stake reframes the encounter from zero-sum combat to a negotiation about time and meaning. Who will be allowed to continue in which ways and with what recognition? This question reduces the imagination of the opponent from an adversary to a co-actor in a limited play. Cultivate curiosity as a muscle. Curiosity is not naivete. It is disciplined interrogation with the aim of understanding rather than vanquishing. Ask the other, what will it cost you if this changes? More often than not, opponents are clinging less to doctrine than to a fear for a child, fear for reputation, fear of being erased. Naming that fear aloud can introduce empathy into a space crowded by accusation. It does not guarantee agreement, but it opens a route to repair that simple rhetoric cannot reach. Yet, internal work alone will not be enough. Conflict is partly structural and must be addressed with protocols that distribute time and voice more fairly. One basic principle is to insist on pauses that honor temporality. When a debate accelerates into moral panic, built-in cooling periods can prevent irrevocable harms. These are not evasions. They are safeguards that recognize our finitude and the high cost of decisions made under existential duress. Design conversations so that urgent decisions have staged deliberations. An initial airing, a reflection interval, then a reconvening. Such temporal scaffolding prevents fury from hardening into permanent exile. Another structural move is to create institutions for humility and accountability, rituals not of punishment but of witness. Restorative practices, where harmed parties and those who harmed them gather with neutral facilitators to tell truths and seek repair. Honor mortality because they treat reputations and relationships as things that can be mended rather than simply declared ruined. These processes are slow and imperfect, but they refuse the modern habit of reward and exile that turns every misstep into a life sentence. Where possible, embed such rituals in workplaces, schools, neighborhoods, spaces that routinely handle small breaches before they calcify into stalemates. Designing fair reputational economies is essential. In communities where status is forever frozen, people are terrified to risk change. In those where status swings wildly with the news cycle, people are incentivized to spectacle. The healthier middle ground is a reputational system that acknowledges past patterns without making them absolute. Allow people to show change across time. Create probationary pathways for repair that are public and regulated, not secretive or punitive. This is a civic technology as much as a moral one, an institutional recognition that identities can evolve and that mortally aware creatures deserve the chance to do so. Philosophically, we might learn from thinking of conflict as a negotiation about shared finitude rather than a contest for metaphysical truth. If every party in a dispute accepts mortality as a condition rather than a crisis, the question shifts. What shape of future do we jointly prefer within the small sliver of hours available? This reframing encourages compromise not as cowardly surrender, but as a form of distributed stewardship. It asks each actor to articulate what they can keep and what they can yield, not as a transaction of power, but as a reallocation of limited time and meaning. There is a quiet architecture that lives above and beneath our daily decisions. Institutions. They are the slow engines that canalize private urgencies into public patterns. Families teach us how to mourn and to celebrate. Markets translate value into time slices we must sell or buy. Governments set the legal scaffolding that permits or forbids certain ways of living. Institutions can be sanctuaries that take some of the unbearable weight of mortality and distribute it. Pensions that promise care beyond one's working years. Hospitals that hold the dying with skill and ritual. Laws that protect the vulnerable. Or institutions can be crushers, brutal machines that accelerate the tempo of life until every hour feels monetized, every relationship instrumental, and every moment a commodity to be consumed before it expires. When mortality presses on the individual, institutional design becomes moral architecture. Consider how a society treats its elders. A polity that buffers the aged with social supports teaches younger people a different relationship to time, one in which the future is not a cliff but a bridge to be built collectively. In such a culture, choices can be bolder because risk is shared. Experimentation is less punishing because institutions bear some of the aftermath. Contrast this with societies that privatize retirement, medical care, and caregiving until the cost of unforeseen loss falls entirely on fragile households. There, mortality is weaponized into anxiety. Every illness, every failure, threatens to consume the savings and dreams of a life. The result is a narrowing of possibility. Fewer people willing to take the slow apprenticeships that generate depth, fewer parents daring to support children into uncertain vocations, fewer communities able to weather sudden crises. Institutions are not inert. They are human designs that reflect values. The question is not whether institutions exist, they always do, but what they choose to make durable. Some institutional designs honor continuity, others honor novelty. Markets, for example, excel at allocating resources efficiently in the short term but often fail at sustaining long-term public goods, art, slow science, intergenerational care. Governments can, in principle, correct this by underwriting time-intensive projects and protecting vulnerable durations that the market ignores. But government itself is shaped by cultural narratives about mortality. Whether the populace sees the future as a public trust or as individual responsibility. Democracies that cultivate the sense that future generations are stakeholders in current policy are more likely to invest in long-term infrastructure, education, and climate resilience. Those that reduce the future to electoral cycles tend to compress time into immediate gains and short-term spectacle. Families, too, are institutions with temporal logic. Some families operate as long arcs, consciously transmitting stories, rituals, obligations, and resources across generations. They create a sense of continuation that softens the sting of individual death by embedding lives in a longer chain. Others, atomistic and transactional, treat relations as malleable and replaceable. Loyalty becomes conditional, and the sense that your life contributes to a durable lineage is weakened. These familial logics shape how children grow into adults. Whether they learn patience and craft, or whether they learn to optimize every hour for immediate return. The moral work on a societal scale is to create institutions, families, schools, workplaces that teach both responsibility to others and capacity for personal flourishing. Markets imprint time as well. The dominant economic regimes in our era reward scalability and rapid measurable impact. If the currency of a career is immediate metrics, then lives bend towards short-termism. Constant portfolio adjustments, opportunistic entrepreneurship that prizes visibility over depth, and emotional labor that must be monetized to be valued. This distorts the relationship to mortality by requiring people to prove their worth continuously as if legacy could be purchased through constant output. There is a corrosive effect. Crafts that require long apprenticeship, the slow patience of science that counts decades, or the delicate work of mentorship are undervalued. The antidote is collective imagination. Policies and cultural signals that value stewardship and the patience to pursue projects whose time horizon surpasses a single quarter. Designing institutions that dignify finitude rather than devour it requires a set of principles that interweave ethics and pragmatics. First, protect buffer zones, spaces where people can fail without catastrophic loss. Universal or targeted basic supports, affordable healthcare, and accessible childcare do more than alleviate poverty. They are temporal insurance that enable risk-taking and long-term commitments. Second, institutionalize sabbaticals and protected creative time. The norm should not be perpetual hustle but seasons of renewed attention to deep work, learning, and care. Third, create rituals of public remembrance and gratitude. Civic days that honor caregiving, local archives that record ordinary lives, and community rites that mark transitions. These rituals do not cost much, but they reteach a population how to hold endings and continuities publicly. Fourth, design for reputational repair. Institutions must not be permanent death sentences for mistakes. Create transparent pathways for restitution and re-entry into social life. Education systems should include not only technical training but moral apprenticeship, conflict resolution, dialogue, and the arts of stewardship. Fifth, decentralized time-making. allow local communities to craft rhythms suited to their needs while ensuring basic protections. Centralization often standardizes tempo in ways that marginalize diverse temporalities. The gardener's slow season, the artisan's apprenticeship, the scholar's multi-year focus. Flexibility permits plural temporalities to coexist. There are deeper philosophical shifts institutions can cultivate that alter how mortality shapes choices. One is the institutionalization of future self-continuity at scale. Design policies that make the future self feel less alien. For instance, default retirement savings plans that nudge people into long-term contribution fold some of one's future into present habit. Education that includes generational storytelling helps children see their lives as chapters in a longer book. Public media that highlight long-term projects, restoration ecology, community art over years, models what delayed payoff looks like. These are pedagogies of patience encoded into public life. Another shift is the elevation of relational metrics alongside productivity metrics. Institutions often measure success in output, GDP, publication counts, quarterly results. But if we also measure the quality of relationships, time spent caregiving, civic engagement, intergenerational exchange, then policy and corporate incentives will follow. Imagine a city that accounts for hours of volunteer assistance in its planning, or a university that values mentorship with promotion credits. Such moves would recalibrate what we honor and thereby what we encourage people to pursue with their finite hours. Yet institutions are made of people, and people have finite bandwidth. Implementation requires political will, cultural storytelling, and small proofs that rework belief. Start small. Pilot programs in neighborhoods that provide guaranteed hours for elder companionship, company policies that mandate sabbaticals, libraries that host apprenticeship exchanges. Each small success shifts narratives. We begin to believe that time can be shared more justly. Over time, these experiments aggregate into norms that change incentives and thus choices. There is also a moral hazard to be guarded against. Institutional paternalism that assumes it knows best how citizens should spend their finite hours. The aim is not to replace personal autonomy with bureaucratic certainty, but to enlarge the range of possible lives. Allow people to choose deep craft, care work, or many short projects without forcing them into one economically viable model. Provide options and scaffoldings, not strictures. The best institutions act like oaks under which many different birds can nest, offering shelter without dictating plumage. We must also be honest about the limits of institutional design. Institutions can mitigate but not eliminate mortality's existential sting. They can redistribute risk and teach rituals, but they cannot erase the fact of ending. Thus, institutions should aim less to abolish anxiety and more to dignify the navigation of it. They should be pedagogues of courage, teaching citizens how to face finitude with clarity, generosity, and practical skills to negotiate their shared hours. Ask yourself, in the hush of your day, which institutions in your life are compressing your options and which are expanding them? Which ones teach you that the future will be held, and which insist you alone must hold it? The practice is to intervene where you can, join boards, vote for policies, start a local ritual, because institutional change is often made by people who begin with small communal experiments. Institutional design is not a remote technocratic play. It is the slow moral art of arranging time so that the weight of mortality is shared and thereby lightened. There is a private weather that moves through us when we think about endings. A tightness like an unseen hand at the throat, a sudden hollowing in the chest, a luminous tenderness that makes even ordinary objects look like relics. These feelings are not mere reactions. They are the mind's language for telling us that something important is at stake. Fear, courage, grief, gratitude. They do not arrive as tidy doctrines, but as textures that insist on being felt. To attend to them is not sentimentalism. It is the basic moral work of learning how to live with a deadline. This part is an invitation to sit with that weather, to learn its seasons, and to develop practical ways of tending the interior climate without being swept away. Fear is the most obvious visitor. It has many faces. The small panic that one is wasting life, the dread of a sudden loss, the chronic hum of insecurity that asks for constant proof of worth. Fear narrows perception. Under its sway, the world becomes a series of threats to be defended against and pleasures to be hoarded. But fear also has a clearer voice if we listen. It names what we value. The trembling beneath your thought points to what you care enough about to be afraid of losing. A useful practice is to translate fear into information. When dread flares, ask gently, what does this fear signal about the life I want? This question converts panic into a map. It does not remove the ache, but it channels it into a direction. Toward repair, toward deeper alignment, toward pragmatic planning. Courage is often misunderstood as the absence of fear. In lived experience, courage is fear dressed in action. It is the decision to speak a truth, to hold a hand, to begin a project despite foreknowledge of fragility. Small, repeated acts of courage train a nervous system to tolerate risk. They build a muscle memory for stepping forward in the face of finitude. Practice courage by choosing projects that are bounded, not everything, but one thing for a season, and keeping the commitment even when the temptation to postpone or give up arrives. These micro-courageous acts accumulate and alter the temperament. Over time, a life once governed by caution becomes governed by chosen fidelity. Grief is the shadow that follows any meaningful attachment. There is a cultural tendency to treat grief as an abnormality to be cured quickly, but grief is the wholehearted response to loss. It is evidence you once loved. To deny grief is to deny the depth of your investments. To indulge it without boundaries can trap you in the past. The path through grief is not a straight line, but a practice of integration. Rituals help. Naming losses aloud, writing them in a ledger, telling a friend, lighting a candle, transforms private ache into shared history. Mourning is not a solitary project. It needs witnesses. Invite others in small ways. Read a letter aloud, keep a remembrance shelf, mark anniversaries with quiet acts. These gestures do not remove the sorrow, but they teach the nervous system that grief is a communal weather, not a private catastrophe. Gratitude, paradoxically, is the companion of mortality. When time is limited, appreciation becomes fierce. But gratitude that is vague or glib accomplishes little. The depth of gratitude resides in specificity. The exact warmth of a hand in yours, the precise sound that made you laugh last winter, the particular sacrifice someone made on your behalf. Make a practice of precise gratitude. 3 concrete things each day, described with as much sensory detail as you can summon. This habit sculpts the mind to notice and to lengthen the span of attention. Over months, it becomes harder for life to slip by unnoticed. Ordinary hours accumulate into a treasury of remembered tenderness. Psychologically, these states can be trained and balanced by concrete practices that are neither mystical nor difficult. Begin with the diary as laboratory. On paper, name the fear, the courage, the grief, and the gratitude of the day. Write without censorship for 5 minutes. Then rewrite the most important line into a sentence you will reread in anxious hours. This simple act builds a private archive that can be returned to, evidence that you have navigated storms before. Couple that with a future self letter. Write to the person you will be in 5, 10, 20 years. Describe the life you hope they will be living and the small decisions you are making now to steward that outcome. This practice thickens continuity and makes long-term choices feel like promises rather than abstractions. There are also somatic routes. Our minds are lodged in bodies, and the body remembers before the story reaches our frontal lobe. Slow breathing, gentle movement, and focused attention on bodily sensations reduce the immediacy of panic. Try this. When fear arrives, place a hand over your heart, feel its movement for 60 seconds, and name 3 small things you can do in the next hour. This sequence, ground, register, act, shifts you from being swamped by emotion to using it as data. It creates a loop of responsiveness rather than reactivity. Therapy and community-based practices matter too. There is no shame in vocational or spiritual help. These are crafts for a finite creature. A therapist teaches tools for navigating fear and grief. A religious or contemplative community offers shared rituals that translate private loss into public memory. Choose practices that recalibrate not to erase but to make room. Try a grief group, an accountability cluster for creative commitments, or a mentorship that orients you to a longer arc. These are not admissions of weakness. They are investments in a sturdier interior architecture. Philosophical reframing is another tool. Stoic and contemplative traditions teach acceptance of what is outside our control and fierce responsibility for what is inside it. This is not resignation. It is clarity. Rehearse the question, what choice now would my most generous self make, knowing that life is finite? Let that question be a compass in moral fog. It will not yield immediate comfort, but it will orient action toward integrity. There are gentle, practical rituals that bridge inner feeling with outer life. Compose a legacy list not of monuments but of relationships you want to tend. A list of 5 people you will call this month with intention. A file of places you want to visit with someone you love. A small project you want to begin because it teaches you patience. Make a memento mori practice that is not morbid. A small, visible reminder. A pebble on your desk, a watch turned face down, a saved photograph. Each time you catch your eye on it, ask one brief question. In this hour, what will make me say I did not squander my time? Respond with one tiny act. Finally, cultivate compassion, both for others and for yourself. In the landscape of mortality, everyone stumbles. We act from fear, we lash out, we hide. Compassion does not mean condoning harm. It means seeing the frightened animal beneath the armor and responding with boundaries paired with repair. Practice a daily pause in judgment. When you notice contempt or disdain, ask, what wound might this person be trying to protect? This question opens channels toward understanding that diffuse blame and invite healing. Hold, for a moment, a simple question that will follow you. If today were the most important day of your life for reasons you cannot name, what would you change? Not as a dramatic rebuke, but as a diagnostic. Taste that question for a week. Let it highlight small misalignments. Then alter one trivial thing. A more honest conversation, a letter, a sunset watched without screens. Mortality does not demand grand gestures. It asks for fidelity in the little things. In the hush that follows these practices, you will find not certainty but steadier footing. The weather inside you will still change, and storms will still come. But you will learn to navigate rather than be wrecked. That is the practical grace mortality offers. Not a neat solution, but an invitation to live with more skill, tenderness, and deliberate courage. There is an ecology between the self and the social that rarely gets described plainly. Our inner habits and the external rhythms we inhabit do not simply coexist. They shape one another in feedback loops that either amplify flourishing or accelerate fracture. When your private rituals are in tune with your community's patterns, a kind of consonance arises. Choices feel easier because the social world supports them. When they diverge, the friction is not merely inconvenient. It becomes existential. The awareness of mortality is the lever that tilts this ecology toward either generosity or withdrawal. It is in this relational soil that the tender shoots of meaning either break surface or wither unseen. Consider the small ways the social world scaffolds private courage. A neighbor who reliably shows up to listen, a mentor who returns a critique with concrete encouragement, a workplace where small failures are spoken of as instructive. These are the micro-infrastructures that make risking time on a project possible. They are the social equivalent of a safety net. Mortality asks us to risk. After all, only by risking can we hope to leave a trace beyond ourselves. But risk without witnesses is vanity or madness. The presence of others who will remember, who will retell, who will steward a project if we cannot changes what kinds of risks are rational. In societies where memory is communal, where apprenticeship, mentorship, and narrative transmission are institutionalized, people can afford to invest in slower, deeper work because the communal ledger preserves and amplifies their contributions. Yet communities are not only repositories of memory, they are also crucibles where identities are forged and contested. The tension between belonging and autonomy is most acute when mortality is close because both stakes are magnified. To belong is to have one's life witnessed. To be autonomous is to make a life that is recognizably yours. The ideal social ecology allows for both. It recognizes that belonging requires boundaries that do not suffocate creativity, and that autonomy needs the reciprocal gaze of others to be legible. How might we design such an ecology in practice? Begin by cultivating witnessing rituals. These are small, repeatable acts in social life where people declare not only what they have achieved, but what they intend to steward in one another's names. Public commitments bracketed by shared promises to remember and to hold accountable. A witnessing ritual might be as simple as a monthly circle in which people speak one intention aloud and everyone else offers one practical act they will perform to support it. It creates a culture where time risk is communal rather than solitary. There is also the matter of conversational practices. The way we talk about our priorities shifts social expectations. When we flippantly remark that we are too busy for a friend's milestone, we model a social economy of scarcity. When we speak instead of the limited number of projects we are holding and why each is meaningful, we model discretionary constraint, an ethic of chosen limits that clarifies where social help might be most meaningful. Small shifts in language cultivate different norms about how time is owed and to whom. Ask yourself, what sentences do you offer that normalize either endless availability or rare, sacred attention? Language is the soft architecture of social time. Conflict, too, lives in this ecology. Mortality gives urgency to standing one's ground, which is sometimes right and sometimes destructive. Communities can mitigate destructive escalation by normalizing dissent and ritualizing repair. Imagine a culture where disagreement is expected but has mandatory cooling and retelling phases. First, state your grievance plainly. Second, each side retells the other's position allowed to confirm understanding. Third, pause. Fourth, reconvene with a shared observer who facilitates naming the losses and possible reparations. These are procedural safeguards that honor our finitude by preventing the burning down of relationships in moments when the future feels most perilous. They are not panaceas, but they are better than the default of scorched earth. Economic structures are part of the ecology too. Time is allocated by markets and by laws, and where incentives reward only immediate output, social support for long-term projects shrinks. Collective imagination is required to change this. Think of communities that create time banks, where hours of care or mentorship are currency. Cooperatives that underwrite long-term creative ventures. Municipal policies that trade tax breaks for corporations that formalize sabbatical policies. These are practical rewirings of the ecology, measures that translate individual finitude into collective generosity. They treat time as a common, not merely a personal asset to be hoarded. There is a spiritual dimension here as well, one that escapes tidy labels. For many, belonging is not merely social but sacramental, the feeling that ordinary actions participate in larger meanings. Rituals, public liturgies, neighborhood memorials, family photo nights can sacralize ordinary temporalities so that small acts feel profound. This sacralization does not require religious belief. It requires intentionality and repetition. When a community sets aside space to mark transitions with solemnity and care, it teaches citizens to recognize the sacredness of finite time. It says, in effect, your hours matter and will be noticed. But generosity in the ecology of time must be mutual. There is a danger in fetishizing communal memory in ways that make it a burden. Asking elders endlessly to be repositories of tradition, demanding that caregivers give without replenishment, or expecting artists to sacrifice material well-being for posterity. Reciprocity is the stabilizer. Communities that thrive design loops of replenishment, paid caregiving, community grants for cultural workers, recognition programs that turn gratitude into material support. Reciprocity is what prevents generosity from becoming extractive. What of loneliness, the felt gap between self and social world within this ecology? Sometimes loneliness arises not from absence of people, but from the absence of relevant practices that make one's life legible to others. A person may be surrounded by faces yet feel invisible because there are no rituals where their commitments can be shared and upheld. Creating those rituals is an act of civic kindness. Host communal story nights, neighborhood skill exchanges, mentorship salons. These practices do not solve the metaphysical ache of mortality, but they reduce the friction that makes solitude unbearable. They let private time risk be underwritten by public memory. There is ethical complexity when social ecologies are diverse. Plural communities will have conflicting temporal logics. One group may prioritize continuity of land stewardship, another the freedom to migrate for opportunity. One may honor slow apprenticeship, another prize immediate economic survival. Navigating plural ecologies requires translation skills, not merely mediating disputes, but creating shared spaces where different temporalities can be respected. This can be done by zoning temporal commons, physical and temporal spaces reserved for slow craft, for intensive caregiving, for celebration, that allow different life rhythms to coexist without mutual erasure. Ask yourself now, what microecological practices would change your life? Whom could you invite to your witnessing ritual? Which local institutions might accept a pilot for protected creative time? What language could you begin using that honors chosen limits? These questions are practical doorways into redesigning the social habitats that surround you. Finally, hold a quiet paradox. The more you accept your finitude, the more you can become generous with others' time. Mortality, when integrated, loosens the grip of possessive urgency. It allows you to say, I have only so many hours, and here is how I will spend them, while making room to steward someone else's hours with generosity. The ecology that results is not utopian sameness, but an intricate mosaic where some tiles are slow and thick, others thin and quick, and the contrast is what produces a living pattern. Imagine one small change you could enact this week that would make your private time more legible to someone else. A conversation, a commitment, a ritual. Try it. Notice how the social world answers. There is a craft to living that is rarely taught. Not how to maximize output or optimize for success, but how to arrange one's days so that the fact of finitude becomes a companion and not a dictator. If the previous parts have traced the problem, how mortality reframes choice into weight, how social rhythms and institutions interact with private time, how creativity and conflict are pressured by the awareness of ending, this part will turn to the practical art of building a life that answers that pressure with structural intelligence and moral tenderness. Imagine a life redesigned like a small house. Deliberate rooms for work and rest, windows that let in light at predictable hours, a hearth where people gather and warm themselves, and a back door through which you can leave when you need to breathe. The details will be specific to temperament and circumstance, but the general design principles can guide any person or community that wishes to befriend mortality rather than be terrorized by it. Begin with the architecture of the day. Time is most easily shaped at the scale of hours. Choose anchors, non-negotiable practices that act as keystones for your inner clock. These anchors are not heroic acts but small, repeatable commitments. A 10-minute morning ritual of stillness and intention, a shared meal each evening without screens, an afternoon block devoted to focused work followed by a walk. The power of anchors is that they provide a dependable rhythm. In a life under the weight of time, reliability is a soft form of courage. Anchors do more than organize productivity. They accrete meaning. A daily journal entry that names one gratitude, one difficulty, and one action for tomorrow creates, over months, a palimpsest of growth. What seems trivial on day 1 becomes the scaffolding for a life that feels coherent on day 700. Pair anchors with constraints. Paradoxically, freedom flourishes under chosen limits. Decide the number of projects you will hold at once and ruthlessly enforce that cap. Give each project a time-bound residency, 3 months, a year, after which you review, not to judge with perfectionism, but to learn. Constraints convert anxiety-inducing possibility into a field for depth. They make decisions easier because they remove the tyranny of endless options. If you feel the itch to perpetually pivot, ask, which of my current commitments would I be willing to tend with patient, imperfect love for the next 12 months? The capacity to answer that question is a discipline. It is how mortality becomes a tutor for fidelity. Cultivate covenants, agreements with people that are not mere conveniences but moral technologies. A covenant differs from a promise because it includes form and witness. Think of it as a mini-institution. Examples: a weekly half-hour with a friend in which you practice attentive listening to each other's struggles without offering solutions. A formal agreement with a partner to rotate caregiving tasks, and a yearly ritual to renegotiate those terms. A professional covenant with a team that protects a day for deep work and prohibits meetings on that day. Covenants honor finite hours by reducing friction around expectations. They are small democracies of time in which everyone trades transparency for predictability. Their witnessing element, other people who hold you accountable, makes the commitment stick where solitary resolutions often fray. Design a public ledger of small practices in your community. These are civic rituals that require modest investment but yield large returns in communal memory. A monthly remembering circle, where neighbors bring one story about someone the neighborhood has lost or admired. An annual project day, when local makers open workshops to the public. A neighborhood time bank where an hour of help mowing a lawn equals an hour of help receiving groceries. These practices do not replace national policy, but they model a culture where time is a shared good. They teach reciprocity and keep alive the sense that your hours accumulate not only into personal biography but into civic capital. Make a covenant with failure. Mortality encourages risk because there is no safe way to prove significance. Yet modern economies punish failure harshly. Create a ritual that destigmatizes the attempt. A quarterly failure salon, where people present things that did not work and what they learned. Pair it with concrete support, microgrants for second attempts, mentorship for iteration. This turns the terror of wasting precious hours into an educational loop. It is temporal justice for the experimental life. Embed practices to maintain future self continuity. These are not abstract exercises but concrete habits. Automated savings plans that treat your future comforts as obligations you cannot skip. Letters to your future self read on a set date. A health covenant with a physician that includes not only treatment but a multi-year plan for prevention. And a project archive, where you store iterations and lessons so future collaborators can continue your work. These practices shrink the psychological distance between the you who plans and the you who will inherit the results of your choices. Practice ritualized endings. Endings unmarked become leaks. They drain the sense of closure and sap energy. For everything you start that matters, projects, relationships, positions, design an ending ritual at the beginning. A simple template. A public declaration of intention, a mid-course review, and a closing ceremony that acknowledges what was gained and what was left undone. When people leave jobs, ask for a structured handover that includes not only technical notes but a short oral history of the role. When relationships shift, cultivate farewell practices that articulate gratitude and lessons. These rituals prevent accumulation of unprocessed transitions and teach the community how to carry continuity without erasing departure. Adopt social witnessing rituals in close circles. Do not wait for ache to become catastrophe before saying what matters. Once a month, meet with one or two people and state aloud one thing you most fear losing and one small action others could take to help you keep it. Offer the same in return. This practice creates a network of intentional witnesses who reduce the loneliness of bearing big choices. It also democratizes courage. When several people practice it, the social bar for vulnerability lowers, and more authentic lives become possible. Learn the art of bounded generosity. Mortality invites us to be generous because we feel the brevity of our hours. Yet generosity must be sustainable. Define what you can give: time, money, presence, and design an envelope for it. Make it visible. Put it on the calendar. When generosity is institutionalized at the personal level, it becomes a stable resource rather than sporadic guilt. Encourage your workplace to do the same. Company-sponsored volunteer time, paid caregiving leave, and formal mentorship credit. These convert private virtue into public design. Design reputational repair mechanisms where you live. If someone harms another, create steps for restitution that involve acknowledgement, practical remediation, and a public process for re-entry. This prevents permanent exile and keeps social time plastic enough to allow learning and restoration. It is radically pro-life. It insists that a human's hours remain claimable, even after mistakes. Stoke precise gratitude as daily medicine. Make a micro-thank practice. Each day, send one short message to someone that names a concrete way they mattered. Gratitude not only lengthens subjective time, it creates a social echo chamber of care. It teaches people that their hours are noticed and transmuted into communal memory. Train attention like a craft. Single-tasking scaffolds deep time. Long-form attention habits. Reading long books, engaging in craft, sitting quietly. Retrain the nervous system to resist the tyranny of distraction. Do one long-form activity weekly that demands sustained attention. Protect it as you would a meeting with a sacred other. Over months, these sessions expand your sense of available time by converting shallow minutes into dense experiences. Finally, build exit protocols for overcommitment. Mortality's pressure can make you overpromise in the name of significance. Create a rule. When you reach your cap of projects, you must either pause one or say no until a review. Make the process public to your accountability partners. Exiting with ritual preserves dignity. Announcing with gratitude preserves relationships. Decline with clarity, not shame. What would a lifetime finished under these designs feel like? Not flawless, not triumphal, but legible. You would have a map of seasons you had tended, witnesses who could tell about you with warmth, institutions that buffered risk and offered repair, and a private interior whether you had learned to read and answer. The weight of time would remain. It cannot be removed, but it would be distributed, shared across covenants, community practices, and institutional scaffolding, so that the burden of being finite would become, paradoxically, the ground of more generous and courageous living. Hold these questions like lanterns to guide the coming weeks. Which anchors can you create this month? Whom will you invite into a covenant of accountability? What ritual of ending will you design for a project you currently neglect? Which local institution could host a failure salon or a witnessing circle? And who could you ask to help make it happen? These are not mere to-dos. They are experiments in moral and temporal engineering. Try one. See how it changes the texture of an ordinary day. How to orient your small and public acts so that each hour counts without turning into a cruelty to yourself or to others. Begin by remembering the simplest truth we have been circling. Mortality is the grammar of meaning. It punctuates sentences. It assigns emphasis to verbs. It insists that every yes is also a no to other possible lives. This grammar is not fair and it is not neutral. It blesses some choices with courage and punishes others with regret. It produces loneliness and creativity, binders of community and scorched grounds of conflict. Recognize this not as a condemnation, but as an accurate reading of the human condition. When you know the shape of the problem, you can design humbler, wiser responses. If you take away nothing else, take away 3 linked practices that, together, change how mortality composes your days. The first is the discipline of chosen limitation. The second is the cultivation of witnessing, people and rituals that hold your commitments. The third is the design of institutions and small public acts that redistribute temporal risk. These are practical. They are not romantic metaphors. They are tools you can begin to use tomorrow. The discipline of chosen limitation is a moral technology that converts anxiety into fidelity. It asks you to name what matters and to reduce the number of arenas in which you are required to be excellent. Not by resignation, but by directed love. Choose 2 or 3 projects, commitments, or relationships that will receive the bulk of your attention for a meaningful season. Make the choice aloud, write it in a place where you can see it, and set a review date. This discipline is not about cowardice. It is about depth. It helps you say no in a way that protects the integrity of the yes. It teaches your nervous system to prefer continuation over novelty. In the face of mortality, commitment becomes a courageous posture. You are telling time, I will stand here for a while, and that standing can generate richness that flitting never can. Cultivating witnessing is a social practice with private consequences. Mortality is less crushing when others remember you, hold you accountable, laugh with you, and carry some fragments when you cannot. Build small networks of witnesses. These need not be grand or many. They must be reliable and intimate. Create monthly telling circles. Pair accountability partners who promise to read one another's work or to show up on hard days. Formalize a covenant with a friend to be the person who reminds you of your promises when you forget. Witnessing turns lonely courage into a shared enterprise. It multiplies the value of your hours because others will carry your traces forward if you falter. It also reduces the temptation to make every act a monument. Knowing someone will witness your persistence, you can be less performative and more patient. Designing institutions and public rituals that dignify finitude moves the ethical problem from private therapy into collective responsibility. Mortality becomes needlessly cruel when economic structures, workplace expectations, or cultural narratives force people to privatize risk and perform urgency. Begin locally, advocate for sabbaticals in your workplace, propose a neighborhood remembrance evening, sponsor a failure salon at your library, or volunteer to start a time bank. Small institutional experiments rewire norms. When a company protects a day of deep work, employees begin to take longer stances. When a neighborhood remembers its dead annually, grief becomes a communal weather rather than a private catastrophe. Over time, these practices accrete into public expectations that reduce the tyranny of immediate measurability and allow longer, riskier, more meaningful projects. Alongside practices, we need attitudes, philosophical habits that reconfigure how mortality feels. One attitude is humility about verdicts. Do not let a single moment or failure define the whole ledger of a life. Cultivate the habit of narrating your life as chapters rather than a single judgment. Another attitude is pluralism of value. Resist the impulse to let one framework, economic success, notoriety, spiritual sainthood, become the only index of worth. Give your life a portfolio of values: care, craft, curiosity, civic care, so that when one is diminished, another can be tended. A third attitude is generosity toward the future. Treat future selves and future neighbors as moral claimants whose hours deserve consideration now. These attitudes are not airy ideals. They are the soil in which concrete practices take root. Psychological tools matter too. When fear arrives, speak to it as you would to a child who has misread a shadow. Name it, ask what it wants to protect, and offer one small, actionable step that answers the underlying value. Transform grief into ritual. Write a short letter, light a candle, or arrange a remembrance. Train attention through weekly blocks of uninterrupted time and a daily micro-practice of chronicling small, exact gratitudes. These techniques are simple, but repeated, they reshape the nervous system's response to finitude from alarm to craftsmanship. Philosophy offers consolations, but not escape. Stoic clarity, existential insistence on choice, Buddhist acceptance of impermanence, humanist commitment to shared flourishing. Each offers tools for a life under the weight of time. Do not adopt these as dogma. Use them as lenses. Try thought experiments. Imagine your 80-year-old self asking for counsel. Imagine your choices through the eyes of a neighbor whose life they will touch. Imagine the possibilities that persist if you keep a project going another year. These mental rehearsals thicken future self-continuity and make long-term investments psychologically tangible. Ethics asks that we widen our circle. Mortality is not only an individual drama, it is a communal condition. The most profound moral acts are those that do not merely relieve one person's anxiety about being forgotten, but that redistribute time and memory across networks. Care for elders, support public arts that preserve fragile crafts, design workplaces that allow apprenticeship and sabbatical. These are ethical acts that change the shape of what it means to be mortal in a society. They are also political. They require public imagination, small policy shifts, and persistent civic effort. If you care about legacy, do not merely sculpt your monument. Work to build the scaffolding that lets many others live richer, longer arcs. And finally, practice the small, everyday courage of presence. Mortality's weight is most intelligible in small moments. The hand you hold, the book you finish, the apology you make when the hour is still soft. These acts are not dramatic. They are accumulative. Each one is a vote cast for the kind of life you want to leave behind. They do not guarantee immortality. They guarantee something rarer and truer. The formation of a life that, when told by others, will sound like someone who tried honestly and loved generously. Ask yourself, as you close these pages, which of the practices offered will you try this week? Which institution near you could use one small redesign? Whom will you invite to be a witness to a project you will hold for a year? How will you honor one ending you have been avoiding? Do not treat these as all to dose. Choose one and begin. Mortality favors the patient. It does not need to be hurried into wisdom. The weight of time will remain. It will sink into you in sudden realizations and in quiet embers at the end of day. But a weight properly carried is not simply burden. It is ballast. Keeps a life from spinning. It gives a trajectory meaning. Let mortality teach you how to choose, not by shrinking your world into panic, but by concentrating your love, clarifying your promises, and building with others institutions and rituals that make finite hours meaningful and reparable. Live as if your choices matter, because they do, and build, at the edges of your reach, the small, stubborn structures that let many lives be lived with dignity. Close now with a small task. Write one sentence that begins, "If I had only 1 year to deepen something in my life, I would." Make it specific. Put it somewhere you will see it. Return to it weekly and let it carve a channel through the rushing stream of days. Let the work begin.